Tonight we're not chasing glory, no gleaming cavalry charge, no clean story where courage and cleverness decide the day. Tonight we step into the other war, the one that doesn't announce itself with trumpets or banners, the one that rides closer than any enemy scout ever could, tucked into the warm seams of a coat, hidden in the honest sweat of a marching man. I'm the Forbidden Dispensary, and I deal in the things you don't see until they're already inside you. Before we go any further, do me one favor. If you genuinely enjoy this kind of descent, if you like history when it's raw and unromantic, subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always want to know how far this voice carries in the dark. Now, lower the lights. Let the modern world fall away. We're going to places where prayers were plentiful, soap was rare, and a tiny insect could topple an empire. The year is 1489. The sun has turned the plains outside Granada into a pale, shimmering cruelty. In the distance, the city holds itself like a secret. White walls, sharp angles, geometry that looks too clean to be real. Granada is the last jewel of the emirate, the final breath of nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule in Iberia. A city that knows it is being watched, measured, starved. And outside those walls, another city has risen from dust and discipline. Canvas streets, iron mouths of cannon, piles of grain and prayer. It is a metropolis built for conquest and obedience. Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon have dragged their vision here, stitched it into tents and supply wagons, and dared history to deny them. For years, their reconquest has been a slow grind, a crusade with paperwork. 10 years of siegecraft, alliances, money and steel. Now there is only Granada left. By the standards of the age, this is a masterpiece. Tens of thousands gathered, soldiers and mercenaries, engineers and gunners, scribes who count barrels like sins, priests who keep the conscience of the camp polished and loud. The army is disciplined, modern, confident in its own structure. They have cannon to bruise stone. They have command lines that hold. They have monarchs who believe the cross itself is marching with them. They think they have accounted for everything. Every breach, every sortie, every starving defender inside the walls. But war has always had another commander, quiet, indifferent, and patient. And this commander does not care about doctrine. It does not ride a horse. It does not sign treaties. It does not even need language. It gathers in the folds of cloth. A siege camp is a city without the organs that make a city survive. No sewers, no running water that stays clean for long. Too many men packed too close, eating poorly, sleeping worse, heat in the day, damp cold at night, blankets shared without questions, clothes worn until they become a second skin, stiff with sweat and grime. And as the months drag forward, summer burning into autumn, autumn bleeding into winter, the camp begins to ferment. Not in the obvious ways, not with one dramatic catastrophe. It's smaller, meaner, more intimate than that. It begins with itching. A man scratches without thinking, fingers finding a bite under his collar. Another man does the same. A third laughs about it, calls it a soldier's tax, flicks something small from his sleeve. They curse fleas, blame straw, blame the cheap blankets, blame anything that doesn't require them to admit the truth. There is a population growing in the stitches of their lives. The body louse, pediculus humanus corporis, doesn't need mud to thrive. It needs warmth. It needs people pressed together. It needs cloth that isn't washed and seams that stay close to skin. It is a creature of congregation, not merely filth. And an army is the greatest congregation Europe can offer. The Spanish camp becomes a sprawling ecosystem, and inside the gut of that louse, smaller still, rides the true assassin, a bacterium with a name that will one day be spoken in laboratories and textbooks. Rickettsia prowaziki. It cannot live alone. It requires a host within a host, like a curse that needs a body and then needs another body to carry it forward. Here is the mechanism, ugly in its simplicity. A louse feeds on a man. While feeding, it defecates, tiny specks of waste, hardly noticeable, threaded with bacteria. The bite itches. The man scratches. Fingernails rub the contaminated specks into the broken skin. The bacteria enter. The war begins inside the bloodstream. No trumpet sounds. No warning flag is raised. Nothing about it feels strategic. It is merely life, doing what life does. At first, the camp shrugs it off. A headache here, a chill there. Who doesn't feel sick after sleeping on cold ground? Who doesn't ache after hauling cannon? The physicians see tired men and call them tired. They prescribe the usual things: rest when possible, prayers always, a bleeding if the patient looks hot, a purge if the patient looks full. But then the fever arrives, not a gentle warmth, a brutal ascent that turns a man into a furnace. One moment he shakes like he's drowning in ice, the next he burns with a heat that makes his eyes glassy and his tongue thick. He sweats through his shirt and still feels cold. He loses hours. He loses words. And then, like a signature scrawled by a careless god, the rash appears, often around the 5th day. It starts across the chest and abdomen, small spots blooming like bruises beneath the skin. Pink at first, then darker, then a deep, ominous purple that looks wrong in candlelight. It spreads outward to limbs, as if the body is being mapped by something that wants to be seen. The soldiers give it a name because soldiers always name their fear to make it smaller. They call it El Tabardo, the little cloak, because it seems to drape the body in mottled color. But it is not a cloak of warmth, it is a shroud. Men become delirious. They speak to people who aren't there. They reach for cups that aren't in their hands. Their faces swell and darken. Some cough, dry and hacking, as if their lungs have become paper. Others develop a horror that will haunt every winter campaign for centuries. The circulation falters, tissues starve, and fingers or toes begin to blacken. Gangrene takes its quiet bite. The camp, the proud, disciplined instrument of monarchy, begins to dissolve from the inside. Not because Granada fights brilliantly, because cloth is warm, because men are close, because nobody truly understands what is happening. The physicians are helpless in the way helplessness often dresses itself up. They bleed men who are already draining. They purge men who are already weak. They pray over bodies that cannot hear. They wave herbs like flags, burn incense against the stench, blame bad air, blame bad stars, blame sin. Typhus does not care who is righteous. It does not care who is noble. It does not care who paid for armor and who wears patched wool. It moves through the tents with a democratic cruelty, passing from body to body on 6-legged feet. No one salutes. Men who ate breakfast standing become corpses by nightfall. Grave diggers fall behind. Then the men asked to dig fall sick too. Then the pile becomes a landscape. A siege is supposed to be a test of endurance, a contest of supplies and will. But here the test is being administered by an enemy that doesn't need walls breached or gates opened. It only needs time, and in the last months of 1489, time becomes the Spanish army's most dangerous shortage. Combat had taken thousands over the year. This takes far more, far faster. An army can plan against arrows. How do you plan against the invisible? How do you negotiate with a louse? The siege wavers. Morale collapses in the way a fever breaks a man, suddenly, without dignity. This camp was supposed to be the visible shape of Christian power, order in tent rows, discipline in drill, divine purpose written into logistics. Now it feels like an enormous sick room, a sprawling morgue with prayers floating over it like smoke. And the lesson, though they do not yet have the vocabulary for it, has been delivered. An army is not just weapons and banners. An army is a dense, mobile population, a perfect incubator. You can craft the strongest fortifications and forge the sharpest steel. You can believe with your whole chest that God has picked your side, and still a campaign can be undone by a creature so small no chronicler would bother to sketch it. Spain will persevere, it will hold. 3 years later, in 1492, Granada will fall. The victory will ring through Europe like a bell. But it will be haunted, because in the dust outside Granada, El Tabardo has introduced itself to history, not as a rumor, not as a local sickness, but as a force capable of rewriting strategy, a plague that prefers soldiers, a sickness with an appetite for crowded cloth and hungry bodies, a silent prophecy of what it will do to kings and campaigns for centuries to come. And it will not remain in camps. Armies move, lice move with them. But the louse also loves a different kind of congregation, one with stone walls, locked doors, and men who cannot leave. A place where overcrowding isn't accidental. A place where despair is part of the architecture, the prison. So now follow me out of the Spanish dust and into a colder darkness, into the British jails of the 16th century where justice kept its books, and Typhus kept its own ledger of names. Walk with me into a place you think you understand. You have a modern picture of a jail, paperwork, procedure, some thin promise of rehabilitation, fluorescent lights and regulations. Erase it. Burn it out of your mind. What I'm about to show you is not a civic service. It's a pit that charges admission, a business built on human containment. A 16th century English prison is not a state-funded institution meant to correct behavior. It is a privately run machine of extraction. A prisoner is not a ward, he is inventory. And the jailer, like any merchant, expects to be paid. Oxford has its names, London has its own, the Fleet, the Marshalsea. Places that sound like geography until you realize their atmospheres. Dank air, rotting straw, coughing in the dark. Men are crammed into cells meant for a fraction of their number, stacked in a way that makes human bodies feel like cargo. You do not sleep so much as fold yourself into whatever space isn't already occupied. The floor is straw when you're lucky, straw that is rarely changed, straw that is a universe, warm, fibrous, full of life you didn't invite. Rats treat it like a highway, fleas treat it like a banquet hall, and lice treat it like a nursery. There is no sanitation in the way we mean it now. Human waste gathers in corners or is dumped into a central yard where it ferments under the open sky. Water is questionable, often contaminated long before it reaches the mouth, and the economics are vicious. You pay for food, you pay for water, you pay for bedding, you pay to have your irons loosened. You pay to exist. The ones with money can buy a better corner, a cleaner mug, a softer chain. The ones without money, the debtors, the vagrants, the petty thieves, are slowly starved into weakness. Their bodies become thin, then fragile, then obedient to whatever microbe decides to take them. And those bodies are crowded together in a constant exchange of warmth. It is a perfect herd. It is, biologically speaking, an invitation. Typhus does not require malice to flourish. It only requires conditions. Overcrowding, infrequent washing, poor nutrition, the thinness that makes immune systems fail like old rope. In prisons, those conditions are not incidental. They are the operating model. So jail fever becomes a known thing, almost expected, like cold stone or bad bread. It preys on people society has already filed away as disposable. The forgotten grow sicker, the forgotten die. But every so often, the disease does something that terrifies the world above. It climbs. It crosses a boundary that was supposed to be solid. Stone walls are not airtight, and Typhus, when it gets the chance, enjoys reminding the powerful that their authority is not immunity. In England, there's a name for the moments when jail fever spills out and stains the town: the Black Assizes. Assizes are court sessions, periodic, official, travelling performances of law. Judges from London ride into county towns to deal with the backlog of cases. It's theatre with sentences attached. A reminder that the king's justice is mobile, watchful, and supposedly clean. But the court draws its raw material from prisons, and prisons, as you now understand, are disease engines. One of the most notorious Black Assizes unfolds in Oxford. The year is 1577. It is summer, and summer has a way of turning stink into something you can taste. Oxford Castle holds the court. The courtroom is crowded. Judges in heavy robes, jurors in their best seriousness, lawyers reciting the shapes of arguments, witnesses shifting their feet, spectators pressed in close to watch misfortune become entertainment. On a hot day, wool becomes a trap. Sweat is a currency everyone pays. Then the prisoners are brought up from below, from the dungeons, from the air that does not circulate. And as they're herded into the dock, a smell rises with them. Noisome, sickly, a living thing. The stench of unwashed bodies, the sourness of confinement, the particular rot of straw that has hosted too many parasites. One prisoner stands out in memory, a bookseller named Roland Jenks, accused of sedition, loud-mouthed and defiant. He is not the only one, but he becomes the face in the story because stories like faces. People later say the smell came from the prisoners like fog. The court officials recoil, offended more than afraid. They lift perfumed cloths to their noses as if scent is the problem. As if what's coming is only air, but by the time you can smell it, it's already too late. Because the louse does not need permission. It can crawl. And when bodies are packed together, when robes brush rags, when sleeves graze shoulders, the transfer is intimate and effortless. Even the dried feces, powdery, nearly weightless, can hitch a ride in disturbed cloth, in the movement of men rising, sitting, leaning close. This is how a prison reaches into the courtroom. This is how the dungeon touches the bench. The trial proceeds. Jenks is sentenced, his ears famously to be cut off. The court performs satisfaction. Justice, they believe, has done its job. Then the real verdict begins to circulate. Days later, people who were in that courtroom begin to fall ill. Not the prisoners first, the powerful. The men whose hands sign papers that change other men's lives. Sir Robert Bell, Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer, dies, a judge with authority vast enough to shape the economy of a kingdom, laid low by a bacterium he can't name. Then the High Sheriff of Oxfordshire. Then knights, then clerks, then jurors. The very men chosen to represent civic order. The disease spreads outward like ripples through Oxford itself. Doctors who tend the sick become sick. Priests who offer last rites begin to shake with chills. Families caring for their loved ones take the fever into their own beds. Over the next month, hundreds die. Oxford, the university town, the place of books and argument, shuts down like a candle snuffed by wet fingers. Panic becomes the only organized policy. What makes the Black Assizes so horrifying is not that typhus exists. Typhus is familiar enough, especially to people who've ever been poor. The horror is the inversion. This is supposed to be a disease of the filthy and the confined, a punishment that stays in the corners of society where no one has to look too hard. It belongs behind prison doors, down among the straw and iron. But in that suffocating courtroom, it leaps across class as if class is imaginary. And in the worst way, it is. Typhus demonstrates a kind of justice more absolute than law. It does not care about titles. It does not care about innocence. It does not care about guilt. It infects the condemned and the condemners alike. The misery kept behind stone has a way of seeping out. Other Black Assizes follow in other places, Cambridge, Exeter, each one a reminder that you can't quarantine suffering forever and call it governance. Jail fever becomes more than a disease. It becomes a verdict on neglect. Now widen the frame. Take the prison model, overcrowding, hunger, filth, movement, desperation, and scale it up until it becomes continental. The jail becomes a kingdom. The prisoners become populations. The stage is Central Europe, fractured into a patchwork, principalities, bishoprics, city-states, the uneasy quilt called the Holy Roman Empire. A political system with too many borders and not enough stability, where religion and ambition share a bed and neither sleeps peacefully. The year is 1618. A local dispute in Bohemia sparks, flares, then detonates, the defenestration of Prague, men thrown from a window, and Europe takes it as a sign. What begins as an argument becomes a 30-year catastrophe. Shifting alliances, religious fury, dynastic appetite. The 30 Years' War is not one war. It's a chain of wars that feed each other like fires in neighboring rooms. And marching through all of it, shaping it, feeding it, often ending it, is Typhus. The armies of this era are not tidy national forces with supply lines and standardized uniforms. They are multinational mercenary cities on legs. Count Tilly's Catholic League. Imperial troops under Wallenstein, brilliant, ruthless, enigmatic. The Swedish forces of Gustavus Adolphus, disciplined, Protestant, dangerous. But for every soldier you picture, there are camp followers. Wives, children, merchants, craftsmen, cooks, prostitutes. The whole shadow society that moves with the army because the army consumes and people will always chase consumption. Logistics are crude. Supply lines as we know them barely exist. An army eats what it can take. It lives off the land with the casual entitlement of locusts. That method does two things with grim reliability. It starves civilians, and it concentrates bodies in filth. So the cycle begins, and it repeats and repeats and repeats. An army enters a region. It seizes grain, livestock, stored food. Villages are left with nothing. People weaken. Immune systems fail. Soldiers sleep packed into barns and makeshift camps, wearing the same clothing day after day, sharing blankets, sharing breath, sharing lice. They even have jokes for them, calling lice comrades, as if humor can make an infestation less real. Then the fever arrives. Camp fever, Hungarian fever, names that try to flatten terror into syllables. Thousands of soldiers die, but the story doesn't end in the camp. Soldiers forage, soldiers desert, soldiers trade, beg, steal. Lice travel with them into villages full of starving peasants already weakened by the army's appetite. And then the army moves on, because a sick army can't stay, and a stripped region can't feed it anyway. It leaves behind a ghost landscape, farms abandoned, fields unplanted, survivors too thin to work, too sick to rebuild. The land begins to rewild, forest creeps back in like nature is reclaiming a debt. And the army carries the infection forward, sowing it into the next province like a curse stitched into boots. This is not warfare as duels between commanders. This is warfare as ecology. And in that ecology, Typhus is a more decisive general than any man with a sword. Campaigns are halted not because of strategy, but because bodies collapse. Armies shrink to skeleton forces without fighting major engagements. Historians like to list battles, White Mountain, Lutzen, Nördlingen, but the arithmetic of the war is written in disease. For every soldier killed by steel or shot, several more die coughing, delirious, rash-covered. A victory is often nothing more than being the side that gets sick later, and sometimes both sides get sick at the same time. Which brings us to Nuremberg, to the standoff that should have been a grand clash and become something else entirely. Nuremberg, 1632. On paper, it looks like destiny. Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, has surged through Germany with the kind of momentum that makes courtiers rewrite their prayers. Wallenstein, the imperial architect of war, meets him with the calm of a man who believes chaos can be managed like a ledger. Two titans, two systems, two visions of Europe staring each other down. So they do what armies do when they're not sure. They dig in. Wallenstein throws up a massive fortified camp, earthworks, palisades, disciplined lines, then dares the Swedes to bleed themselves against it. Gustavus answers in kind, building his own sprawling camp, settling into what becomes a siege without walls. Between them are fields and tension. Around them are nearly 200,000 souls when you count the followers. Cooks, wives, children, merchants, blacksmiths, the people who make an army a moving city instead of a neat block of men. It should end in a battle. It does not, because while the generals watch each other, another commander watches all of them, and this commander loves a standoff. A standoff means time, Time means filth has a chance to mature. Sanitation, never robust, collapses under the weight of numbers. Latrine pits overflow. Water sources become communal soup. Washed hands, animal waste, rotting food, and the residue of too many bodies packed too close. Rations thin. Men eat badly, sleep worse, and wear the same clothes until the cloth itself seems alive. And in that cloth, the body louse thrives. Not as an invader, but as a resident. Then the fevers begin. First a handful, then dozens. Then the ugly acceleration that always feels like surprise, even when it's predictable. Typhus and dysentery, partners in misery, start cutting down men who have not yet fired a shot. It isn't heroic, it's logistical. The sick can't march, can't dig, can't fight, can't even keep themselves clean enough to slow the spread. In the Swedish camp, men begin dying in the hundreds per day. On Wallenstein's side, the same. The proud armies rot from the inside out. After weeks, the standoff becomes something grotesque. Two massive camps staring at each other while both dissolve into death traps. The decisive battle everyone expects is being fought instead in the crowded tents and latrine trenches, in the shared blankets where lice crawl from fever-hot bodies to the next warm host. After 2 months, both commanders do something no chronicle likes to highlight. They retreat, not from each other, from the pestilence. They abandon their positions and drag away what remains of their armies, skeletal columns with hollow eyes, leaving the fields around Nuremberg choked with shallow graves. Men who died not for doctrine or glory, but because a louse found a seam and did what it was built to do. This is how Typhus dictates the rhythm of war. It decides when campaigns can happen. It decides when they must stop. It decides which army can still lift a musket and which one can only lift a cup of water to cracked lips. And it repeats this lesson across Germany for 3 decades. Cities are besieged, and even when their walls hold against cannon, their crowded streets become furnaces of fever. Refugees carry lice into towns, soldiers carry lice into villages. A peasant hiding in the woods can die of typhus, brought by a stranger long before a soldier ever finds him. The distinction between combatant and civilian collapses. So does the population. The Holy Roman Empire is not a unified state, and its records fracture under the same stress as its politics. But the estimates are still enough to make the mind recoil. From around 20 million people down to perhaps 12. Regions struck even harder. Württemberg gutted, Pomerania emptied, entire villages erased, fields returning to forest, houses collapsing into moss. War, famine, and plague all take their bite. But typhus is the relentless engine that keeps turning, feeding on movement and hunger, thriving in the breakdown the war itself causes. When exhausted diplomats finally gather to negotiate peace in 1648, they bargain over a continent that feels like a carcass. The grand religious causes that lit the fuse seem petty in the face of mass graves. The victors are not simply dynasties, not simply confessions. The victors are also a 6-legged insect, and the bacterium it carries. Typhus has proven it can do more than sap a siege camp. It can hollow out civilization. Now, pull yourself forward in time. The year is 1812, and Europe holds its breath again. An army gathers that seems too large to be real, numbers so vast they turn into abstraction. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of the continent, assembles the Grande Armée. More than 500,000 men, maybe 600,000, depending on which ledger you trust. 20 nations contribute to the flood. French and Poles, Italians and Bavarians, Prussians and Austrians. A mosaic of conquered and allied peoples marching under the French eagle toward the wide, indifferent plains of Russia. Napoleon's plan is, on paper, immaculate. He calculates flour and wine, oats and horseshoes, cannonballs and road speed. He maps the lines of advance like a man drawing certainty onto a world that has never promised it. He plans for every contingency of battle. What he cannot plan for, what he does not truly see, is the smallest soldier traveling with his men. The body louse has come along for the ride. It thrives not because the army is dirty in some moral sense, but because it is dense, because men sleep shoulder to shoulder in barns and billets, because washing becomes a luxury, because uniforms are worn for weeks, saturated with sweat, dust, and the slow accumulation of life in cloth. The louse moves quietly from man to man, from regiment to regiment. At first it is a nuisance, an itch lost in the larger discomforts of marching, but inside some of those lice, the bacterium waits. When the army crosses the Niemen River into Russia in late June, the heat is oppressive. Roads dissolve into dust. Dysentery is already stalking the columns, a predictable consequence of fouled water. But soon another fever appears, different in character, different in its cruelty. It begins with a headache, deep, splitting behind the eyes, then chills that rack the body, then a soaring temperature that turns men into shivering furnaces. And then, after days of delirium, the rash blooms across the torso, dark red spots like bruised constellations. Camp fever, jail fever, ship fever, typhus. Veterans who have stood under Austrian cannon become weak and confused. They stumble out of the column and collapse by the roadside, left behind because an army this size cannot stop for every sick man without becoming a sick army entirely. Napoleon's medical corps, no matter how organized, cannot handle the reality of contagious disease on this scale. Wounded men are finite problems. A bullet wound does not reproduce. A sick man does. Every fevered body is a factory for lice, and when that body cools with death, the lice abandon it, seeking new warmth. The spread becomes geometric. By the time the Grande Armée reaches Smolensk in August, it has already been bled white, not by Russian bayonets, but by microbes. Tens of thousands have vanished from the rolls, dead, deserted, too sick to continue. The battles, when they happen, are brutal, but they account for only a fraction of the losses. Napoleon presses onward, gambling as he always has. He believes a decisive victory will force the Tsar to the table. He believes Moscow will solve the problem like a key in a lock. Then comes Borodino in September, a grinding slaughter, the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The French win, technically, but it is a victory that feels like losing slowly. The road to Moscow opens. The army that enters Moscow is not the army that crossed the Niemen. It is a hollowed force, delirious, weakened, already half-eaten by typhus. And Moscow is empty. And then it burns. The retreat begins in mid-October, and now the catastrophe becomes complete. 3 dissolving forces converge: starvation, cold, and typhus. The cold drives men closer together. They share blankets. They share coats taken from the dead. They share lice without knowing the exchange is happening. Hunger shatters the body's defenses. Men become thin as wire and just as easily snapped. Typhus, which had been smoldering, erupts. Rickettsia prowazeki constricts small blood vessels. In freezing temperatures, that means disaster. Fingers and toes blacken. Noses and ears die. Gangrene takes what frostbite starts. The retreat becomes a death procession, spectral figures shuffling through snow, the living barely distinguishable from the dead. Along the road from Moscow, back toward the Berezina River and beyond, they leave more than frozen corpses and discarded equipment. They leave infected lice clinging to cast-off cloth, waiting for the next warm body. Russian pursuers, returning peasants, refugees. The disease does not care whose side you're on. Of the 500,000 who marched in, fewer than 50,000 stumble back across the Niemen in December. And even then, the story refuses to end cleanly. Those survivors carry the plague into hospitals in cities like Vilnius and Königsberg. New outbreaks flare across Poland and Germany in 1813, killing hundreds of thousands more. Napoleon, who redrew maps with cannon, is defeated by an organism he cannot see and a vector he did not respect. It wasn't General Winter alone, it was General Louse. And the louse, of course, does not care about uniforms. It will feast on an imperial guard just as gladly as on a tenant farmer. It is equal opportunity misery. A generation after the snows of Russia, the louse will find its next grand theatre not in the clash of armies, but in the quiet, terrible stillness of a starving nation. Ireland, the mid-1840s, a country balanced on a knife's edge, living on one crop, one promise, one fragile miracle of nutrition, the potato. Then the blight arrives, and hunger follows. And behind hunger, as it always does, comes fever. Ireland in the mid-1840s is not a battlefield. There are no cannons lined up in neat menace, no generals with polished boots. If you stand in the fields, you see small plots and stone walls and the hard math of survival. You see families living on an agricultural miracle that makes sense right up until it doesn't. The potato. It can feed a household from a patch of land so small it feels like cheating nature. That's what makes it beloved. That's what makes it lethal. Dependence is always a bargain with a hidden clause. In 1845, the clause arrives on the wind. A blight, Phytophthora infestans, sickens the leaves, blackens them, and turns tubers into something foul and useless in the ground. The harvest fails. Then it fails again. Then again, more completely, until hunger becomes a permanent resident. And starvation, when it settles into a population, is not dramatic at first. It is quiet. It is administrative. It strips fat, then muscle. It dulls the mind. It slows the body down to a crawl. And crucially, this is the part people forget, it dismantles immunity like a carpenter pulling nails from a house. A starving population becomes a population with its defenses switched off. In that weakened landscape, old companions arrive. Famine rarely travels alone. One of famine's most reliable partners is fever. They call it famine fever because people name what scares them in the language they already have. But the thing itself is old. Epidemic typhus, carried in the clothing of the desperate. The mechanism is not mystical, it is brutally practical. As food disappears, rent remains. Landlords evict families who cannot pay. People are pushed onto roads with whatever they can carry, a blanket, a pot, a few rags, a child. They search for work, for charity, for anything that can be chewed and swallowed. And as society frays, the rituals of cleanliness collapse. Washing becomes impossible when water is scarce, when soap costs money you don't have, when your days are spent walking and begging and trying not to die. People wear the same clothing for weeks and months. They sleep crowded together for warmth in ditches, in makeshift shelters, in barns when someone allows it. And in that cloth, in that congestion, the louse thrives. The famine doesn't create lice. It creates the perfect conditions for lice to multiply. So typhus follows hunger down the road like a shadow that grows longer as the sun sets. Relief exists, but it is shaped by ideology more than compassion. The response of the British government, fractured, often cruelly inadequate, is rooted in the belief that direct aid breeds dependency. Instead of food, it offers institutions, the workhouse. Workhouses are not refuge in the way the word suggests. They are deterrents made architectural. To receive help, a family must enter the gates and surrender what little autonomy they have left. Land, if any, remains. Privacy, unity. Men are separated from women, children from parents. Everyone becomes a unit to be managed. The workhouses are designed to be unpleasant, to ensure only the truly desperate will enter. And the truly desperate arrive in waves. They come weak, they come starving. Many arrive already carrying lice in the seams of their clothes. They are packed into spaces meant for fewer bodies, sleeping on straw pallets, pressed close together, perfect conditions for transmission. In these buildings, typhus spreads like fire through dry grass, not metaphorically, practically. A single infested person can seed a dormitory becomes a ward becomes an outbreak. The air grows thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, vomit, sickness, despair. Feverish murmurs rise and fall through the night like prayers that have forgotten who they're addressed to. Doctors and staff, often trying to help with limited resources, fall ill themselves. In the workhouse, the line between caregiver and victim is thin. It is not only the poor who suffer, it is anyone who enters the ecosystem. The workhouse becomes what prisons were centuries earlier, a disease amplifier. And the fever does not stay behind the gates. It walks out on legs, it rides out in clothing. It reaches soup kitchens and relief depots, follows crowds into port cities where people gather with the last of their strength to buy passage out of the country. And this is where the story turns maritime, because when people flee famine, they do not flee alone. On the docks of Dublin, Cork, and across the water in Liverpool, Typhus boards ships. The vessels that carry Irish families toward North America are often overcrowded, poorly provisioned, and built with profit in mind rather than human survival. The hold becomes a floating workhouse. Low ceilings, stale air, little sanitation, barely enough food or water. Weeks of proximity. They will later be called coffin ships, and the name is not poetic. It is accounting. One infested passenger can cede a hold. Below deck, darkness becomes a tool. Lice do not require light, they require bodies, and bodies are stacked close. People fall sick and cannot move. They die in their bunks. Sometimes they remain there beside the living for days, because there is no strength, no space, and no clean way to handle the dead. The Atlantic becomes not just a passage, but a gamble with an invisible knife. And then, at the far end of that gamble, there is a place designed to intercept disease before it enters the continent. Grosse Île, a quarantine station in the St. Lawrence River, downstream from Quebec City. Canada's attempt at a barrier between the Old World's epidemics and the New World's cities. In the summer of 1847, the barrier is overwhelmed. An avalanche of ships arrives, holds packed with the dying. Flags raised to announce contagion. Dozens of vessels anchor in long lines, waiting to be processed. Priests and doctors who board them describe scenes that feel unreal. People too weak to lift their heads, lying in their own waste, delirious with fever and dysentery, skin marked by the rash that signals typhus has already set its hooks. On the island, tents are raised. Wooden sheds are thrown together. The sick are brought ashore in numbers that turn triage into an impossible joke. There are not enough beds, not enough staff, not enough graves. Thousands die and are buried in mass plots. Grosse Île becomes a monument not just to famine, but to the way famine recruits microbes as executioners. The blight may have started it, but the louse amplifies it into something vast. Back in Ireland, the blight eventually recedes, but the country is permanently altered. At least 1 million dead, another million scattered. And a significant share of that death is not from starvation alone, but from the diseases that hunger invited in. Typhus, chief among them. A fungus on a potato turned into a demographic catastrophe, made sharper by a parasite that requires only cloth and crowding to do its work. And then history performs one of its favorite cruelties. Just a few years later, two powers that presided over famine, Britain and France, send their own armies into another theater where disease waits like a veteran. The Black Sea, the Crimean War. This conflict looks modern in certain angles: telegraphs, steamships, rifled muskets, newspapers sending dispatches home fast enough to keep outrage fresh. It is in many ways a rehearsal for industrialized war. Yet the primary agent of death is ancient. The war begins in 1853, Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire against Imperial Russia. Supplying an army far from home proves to be a nightmare, especially for the British, whose command structure is clogged with aristocratic inertia. The battles, Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, are savage. But the real enemy is again the one no one wants to put on a roster. The winter of 1854 is brutal. British soldiers sit in trenches before Sevastopol, ill-equipped and underfed, lacking proper clothing, fuel, and adequate shelter. They huddle in thin tents and muddy dugouts, wearing the same uniforms for months, uniforms that become ecosystems. Scurvy arrives, dysentery, cholera, and the old familiar fever takes advantage of it all. Typhus. The sick and wounded are shipped across the Black Sea to the barrack hospital at Scutari, on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. What they find there is not medicine. It is an antechamber to the grave. Scutari is vast and filthy, built over a failing sewer. Wounded men lie on straw pallets so close together that walking between them becomes a kind of obstacle course. They remain in the mud-caked clothing they were wounded in. Supplies are scarce, bandages are rarer. The air is a heavy stew of infection and decay. Rats move like staff with no uniforms. Typhus takes hold in this perfect environment: overcrowding, filth, weakened bodies, unwashed cloth. And into this hell walks a woman carrying a lamp. Florence Nightingale arrives in November 1854 with a small group of volunteer nurses. She is determined, relentless, armed with statistics and the kind of will that makes bureaucrats flinch. She does not yet have germ theory, few do. She believes in miasma, in foul air. But her mistake leads her toward the right actions. She declares war on filth. She pushes for sewers to be flushed, for walls to be whitewashed, for floors to be scrubbed until the boards remember what clean feels like. She demands laundry, clean bedding, better food. She fights procurement for soap, for bedpans, for bandages, for any material that can turn squalor back into something human. Her lamp becomes a symbol of compassion, yes. But her real weapon is the scrubbing brush. By cleaning cloth and bedding, she interrupts the louse's life cycle. By reducing crowding and improving ventilation, she makes transmission harder. She does not need to know the bacterium's name to know the habitat it prefers. Even so, the work is uphill. Typhus continues claiming victims, not just soldiers, but staff. A man survives a shell wound, only to die of fever days later, his victory stolen by something that entered through an itchy bite. The statistics are a scandal. In the first winter, for every British soldier killed in action, several die of disease. At Scutari, mortality rates climb to terrifying levels before reforms begin to bite back. Public outrage, fueled by reports and Nightingale's own letters, forces change. Sanitary commissions arrive, drainage improves, water is addressed, death rates fall. But the lesson is carved into the war's ledger. Strategy and firepower are not enough. An army must also conquer the invisible armies inside its own camps. Nightingale returns to Britain a national figure, her legacy entangled with modern nursing, sanitation, and the brutal clarity of data. Yet the louse does not disappear. It waits, and soon it will find a new congregation, one on American soil, in camps of mud and canvas where men will call it by a name that sounds almost friendly: graybacks. America in the 1860s is remembered like a painting. Sepia faces, battle flags, the theatrical geometry of lines advancing into smoke. You can almost hear the speeches history likes to quote, solemn, clean, shaped for monuments. But the war that killed the most men was not the one artists wanted to frame. It was the war inside the camps. It was the war of water and waste, of spoiled food and overcrowded tents, of bodies packed together long enough for the smallest passengers to establish themselves. For every soldier who fell to rifle fire or artillery, more were carried away by disease. And inside the teeming cities of canvas and mud, a silent conflict unfolded against an enemy that wore no uniform, carried no flag, and never accepted surrender. They called it camp fever, a vague diagnosis that covered a multitude of killers: typhoid, dysentery, measles, pneumonia, and always, humming beneath the surface like a bass note, typhus. In the Union armies, the conditions were often awful but functional. Supply lines, strained, still existed. There was at least the idea of logistics as duty. Soap and rations sometimes arrived. Clothing sometimes was replaced. In the Confederacy, the conditions were something darker, a portrait of systemic collapse. The Union blockade tightened like a slow fist around the South's coast. It cut off weapons and powder, yes, but also the ordinary things that keep bodies from becoming breeding grounds: fabric, medicine, salt, shoes, and soap. Soap becomes a luxury. Uniforms are patched until they are stories in cloth. Men go months wearing the same garments, repairing tears with hopeful stitches that hold just long enough for the next march. Wool coats become both armor and prison, heavy, warm, and impossible to wash in winter. They hold heat, sweat, grime, and they hold life. This is where the body louse thrives. It is not dramatic, it is constant. Imagine a Confederate camp outside Richmond in the winter of 1863. Thousands of men huddled together against a cold that seems personal. Smoke from green wood fires hangs low. The smell is an honest inventory: wet earth, unwashed bodies, sickness, grease, gun oil, latrines that overflow when the ground freezes. Men cough, men spit, men scratch. They call the lice graybacks. The nickname sounds almost affectionate, the way soldiers always rename their torment to make it feel less like helplessness. Graybacks are a known misery, a routine annoyance. Men talk about them the way sailors talk about storms. Inevitable, crude, worth complaining about, but not worth believing you can stop. And yet the soldiers fight them. Not with science, not with strategy, but with small, desperate rituals. You'll see men sitting by the fire with their shirts off in freezing air, running a heated bayonet, a hot knife, or a warmed stone along the seams of their clothing. They listen for the tiny pops as lice and eggs die. They call it skirmishing because humor is a kind of shelter. It never lasts. The infestation returns as soon as bodies return to close quarters, as soon as blankets are shared, as soon as one man who missed the ritual lies down beside another. The louse breeds faster than hope, and where the louse settles, typhus waits for the right moment. Typhus in a camp does not arrive with theatre. It arrives like exhaustion. A man complains of a headache and aching limbs. He blames the march, the cold, the hunger. He tries to work through it because soldiers are trained to treat their bodies like tools until the tool breaks. Then the fever climbs, relentless, baking, disorienting. Men become delirious. They talk to ghosts of home. They wake up not knowing where they are. They stumble. They fall. Days later, the rash appears. Small red spots across the torso, the outward sign of a microscopic war inside the blood vessels. In crowded tents and makeshift huts with poor ventilation, the disease jumps from man to man. Not by magic, not by moral failure, but by a louse crawling from one feverish body to the next warm body sleeping inches away. Entire regiments are erased from effectiveness, not by cavalry charges, but by fever. A general can have 10,000 names on the muster roll, but when it's time to march, he might be lucky if half can stand. The others are coughing, shivering, burning, delirious, or dead. Hospitals, if you can call them that, overflow. Often they are barns, churches, warehouses, spaces with sick men lying shoulder to shoulder on filthy straw. The sound is not heroic, it's a constant desperate chorus. Coughing, moaning, prayers, arguments with hallucinations. Surgeons, overwhelmed, have little besides opium, quinine, whiskey, and resignation. They can amputate limbs, they can dress wounds. But against a louse-borne fever, they are mostly witnesses. And the cruelest part is this: they do not understand transmission. They blame miasma, bad air, they blame swamp vapors. They blame the moral condition of camps. They see lice everywhere, of course, but they treat it as a symptom of poverty, an annoyance, not the assassin's courier. So the war becomes a contest of attrition in more ways than one. Not just men and ammunition. Immune systems, access to clean water, access to vegetables that prevent scurvy, access to soap. The Confederacy's logistical collapse becomes a biological collapse. The inability to replace infested uniforms, the scarcity of soap, the thin rations that weaken bodies, these are not minor inconveniences. They are tactical vulnerabilities. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is not only starved into surrender at Appomattox, it is sickened into it. And there is an irony here sharp enough to cut. The grayback, feeding in the seams of Confederate uniforms, becomes as potent a weapon for the Union as any Gatling gun. A tiny arthropod becomes a blockade runner operating deep inside Confederate lines, bleeding the South's armies, one fevered soldier at a time. The louse proves itself a master of 19th century warfare, but its greatest performance is still ahead. Because the 20th century will offer it something it loves even more than tents and trenches. Collapse, mass displacement, millions of bodies moving, crowded, hungry, cold. The perfect ecology. 50 years later, the world changes its machinery: automobiles, airplanes, machine guns. War becomes industrial, timelines, tonnage, chemical formulas, calculated ballistics. When Europe stumbles into conflict in 1914, it carries the full weight of this modernity into the mud. On the Western Front, the war freezes into a static nightmare. Trenches, barbed wire, shell craters, mud that swallows boots and sometimes men. Artillery and machine guns do the bulk of the killing. Disease exists: trench foot, influenza, dysentery. But sanitation, grim as it is at least organized. There are supply lines, there are delousing stations. There is a corridor of horror, but it is contained. To the east it is different. The Eastern Front is vast, mobile, chaotic. Whole armies surge back and forth across Poland, Galicia, and Russia. Empires creak: the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian, ancient structures fracturing under pressure, and into those fractures seep the old plagues. This is not trench warfare as a narrow corridor. It is a war of desperate retreats and chaotic advances, of rail lines broken, villages burned, civilians uprooted. Refugee columns clog roads, sleeping in barns and stations, pressed against soldiers. Infrastructure collapses. Water becomes unsafe. Food becomes scarce. Clothing becomes unwashed by necessity. In this chaos, Typhus finds a continent-sized playground. On the Eastern Front, the louse is not merely a quartermaster's nuisance. It becomes a strategic reality, a weapon of mass disruption, its lethality dwarfing what poison gas or early aerial bombing can accomplish. The numbers do not fit comfortably in the mind. During and after the war, typhus infects tens of millions across Eastern Europe and Russia. Millions die. It thrives in prisoner-of-war camps. It moves with armies. It feeds on disintegration. And nowhere is its power demonstrated more brutally than in a small, battered country that for a moment seems to have achieved a miracle. Serbia, late 1914. The Serbian army, outnumbered and exhausted, throws back an Austro-Hungarian invasion, an embarrassment to the Habsburg Empire and a surge of hope for the Allies. But victory brings prisoners, tens of thousands of them, crowded into makeshift camps with almost no sanitation. And among those prisoners, the bacterium waits. The winter of 1914-1915 is bitterly cold. Serbia's medical services are stretched past breaking. Doctors are scarce. Supplies are scarce. The country is tired down to its bones. Then the fever ignites. It begins in the camps and radiates outward, carried by soldiers, refugees, the constant movement of people. By early 1915, the epidemic becomes one of the most explosive in recorded history. At its peak, thousands of new cases are reported daily. Railroads stop because crews are too sick to work. Government functions sputter. There are not enough beds, not enough nurses, not enough gravediggers. Civilians die in massive numbers. Doctors die trying to help, a quarter of them gone in months. And the Serbian army, heroic, battered, proud, ceases to function as a fighting force. Divisions become infirmaries, barracks become fever houses. It is perhaps the most decisive victory a microbe ever achieves in a modern war. The enemy watches from across borders, cautious, almost irrelevant. Typhus has already done the work, and the world, startled into action, responds with something new: international medical missions, quarantine, mobile bathhouses, and industrial delousing. Steam autoclaves, baking uniforms, shaving heads, organizing sanitation squads. They wage total war on the body louse. Slowly, the epidemic is forced back, but the damage is carved deep. Serbia survives, but its army is diminished, and when invasion comes again in late 1915, resistance breaks and the infamous retreat through Albania begins. An epic of suffering under snow and hunger. And hovering over it, as always, is the truth we keep relearning. The fate of nations can still be decided in the seams of a dirty uniform. But even as millions shiver under fever, a quiet revolution begins somewhere far from the front. Not in trenches, not in camps, in a bright laboratory where observation becomes a weapon. A French physician in Tunis is about to look at typhus and see, for the first time, the door it walks through. For millennia, humanity's relationship with typhus has been one of endurance, a storm you pray through, a curse you blame on foul air or bad morals, something you flee when you can and accept when you can't. Even the smartest minds of their eras often treated it like weather, tragic, seasonal, unavoidable. Then the 20th century arrives with glass lenses and stubborn people who refuse to accept mystery as an answer. And far from the snows of Russia and the mud of Serbia, in a sunlit corner of North Africa, a man notices something that should have been obvious. His name is Charles Nicolle. He is a French physician and bacteriologist, a student of Pasteur's intellectual lineage, and in 1902 he becomes director of the Pasteur Institute in Tunis, capital of the French Protectorate of Tunisia. Tunis is a city of contrasts, ancient Medina lanes and colonial boulevards, commerce and poverty living shoulder to shoulder. And like many cities of the time, Tunis has a typhus problem. It is not always explosive. Often it is endemic, simmering in poorer quarters, flaring into epidemics when conditions sharpen, crowding, cold spells, shortages, movement. The disease is familiar enough that people have accepted it with the exhausted shrug reserved for recurring disasters. Nicolle does not shrug. He begins not with a microscope, but with a clinician's habit. He watches what happens in front of him, and he sees something strange. Out in the city, typhus is terrifyingly contagious. Families living in tight rooms fall ill one after another. Neighbors share a space, then share fever. Transmission seems to leap across households with ease. But inside the French colonial hospital, cleaner, more orderly, structured, something unexpected happens. The chain of transmission breaks. Doctors and nurses tending typhus patients, changing sheets, taking temperatures, handling bodies, almost never catch it. This is not what should happen if typhus is floating through the air like influenza. Not what should happen if it spreads through water like typhoid. A crowded ward should be a bonfire of infection. But it isn't. The disease seems to stop at the hospital doors. Nicolle turns this over in his mind like a coin he can't place. He replays the admission process again and again, not as bureaucracy, but as a sequence of physical events. A typhus patient arrives from the city. Before entering the clean wards, the patient is stripped of their clothing. Filthy, often crawling with vermin. The patient is bathed. Soap, water, scrubbing. Then the patient is put into a clean gown. The old clothes are removed from the system like contaminated evidence, and after that, the patient is still sick, but no longer a source of contagion to staff. Nicolle feels the shape of the answer emerge. The vector is not breath, not touch, not bad air. It's something that is taken away at admission. Something living in seams, folds, and fabric. Something that cannot survive the bath and the change of clothing. The body louse. It is a hypothesis born from observation so simple it feels almost insulting, like realizing the monster was hiding in plain sight. But Nicolle is not a poet. He is a scientist. He knows intuition is worthless without proof. He needs an animal model. He needs to show the chain, link by link, in a controlled environment. First, he experiments with monkeys, with partial success. The real breakthrough comes when he can reliably transmit human typhus to a chimpanzee. He draws blood from a typhus patient and injects it into a healthy chimp. The chimp develops fever. It becomes ill. The disease is now portable into a laboratory setting. Now the question becomes, How does it travel from one host to another? Nicole collects body lice from the clothing of typhus patients and places them on a healthy chimp. Nothing happens at first. Days pass. Still nothing. The experiment looks like failure. But science is often failure that refuses to stop. Nicole recognizes the problem. He needs to ensure the lice are infected. Lice collected from clothing may not have fed on infectious blood recently, or may not survive the transfer long enough, or may not be handled in a way that preserves the chain. So he designs an elegant, brutal sequence. Step 1. Infect a chimp with typhus via blood injection. Step 2. Place a batch of clean, laboratory-bred lice onto the sick chimp and let them feed. Step 3. After days, collect those lice, now engorged, now suspect, and transfer them to a third chimp, perfectly healthy. Then he waits. And after an incubation period, about 12 days, the third chimp begins to shiver. The fever spikes. The illness unfolds with the grim predictability of typhus. Nicole has done it. He has demonstrated the chain of transmission. Human blood to louse, louse to new host. It is a masterpiece of deduction, the kind of science that feels like a lock clicking open. He publishes his findings in 1909. The announcement is quiet in the way world-changing information often is. A paper, a set of observations, a conclusion stated with clinical restraint. But the implications shake public health. Typhus is no longer a miasma, no longer a vague curse. It is a targeted enemy with a known courier. The battle shifts from prayer and quarantine to hygiene and vector control. Delousing stations that will soon save millions in wartime now have a clear purpose. Campaigns centered on bathing and clean clothing become weapons, not mere good habits. Nicole receives the Nobel Prize in 1928 for this work. It is an honor with the weight of lives behind it. He didn't discover a cure. That will come later with antibiotics. He did something more fundamental. He revealed the secret door. He showed the world where the killer enters. But knowing the courier is not the same as catching the killer. Nicole exposes the louse as the messenger, yet the microscopic agent the louse carries is still a ghost. Something glimpsed but not named, not fully understood. Now begins a different kind of war, a race under microscopes, a hunt conducted in blood and glass, and it demands sacrifice. One of the first and most brilliant hunters is an American pathologist from Ohio, Howard Taylor Ricketts. Ricketts is not a man chasing fame. He is methodical, quiet, obsessed with the unseen. He has already done dangerous work in Montana, studying Rocky Mountain spotted fever. There he proves the disease is carried by ticks, and inside the tick's tissues he catches sight, just barely, of a tiny organism that behaves like a bacterium but refuses to live on its own. It seems to require living cells, like a parasite with exquisite demands. In 1909, the same year Nicole publishes, Ricketts turns his attention to Mexico City, where a fever known locally by names echoing Spanish military memory still circulates. He recognizes it quickly. Epidemic typhus. And so he begins the work that even now makes my skin tighten. This is not bench science with safe distance. This is handling the blood of dying patients. This is raising colonies of body lice. This is keeping them alive and warm in little containers, sometimes strapped to patients so the lice can feed on infected blood. Then transferring those lice to healthy animals to prove transmission. The line between researcher and victim is razor thin. Ricketts dissects engorged lice under the lens, teasing apart their delicate gut linings. And there again he sees it. Minute organisms, impossibly small, multiplying where they shouldn't exist. He begins to form a theory. Typhus and spotted fever are caused by a new class of microbes, organisms that sit between bacteria and viruses in behavior, obligated to live inside host cells. He documents everything. Notebooks fill with drawings and observations. He is close. So close that history seems to lean in. But the microbe is not just being studied. It is studying him back. On April 23, 1910, Ricketts feels the first headache. the first chills. He knows immediately what it is. He continues to document his own decline with a scientist's detachment, taking his temperature, noting symptoms, recording the rash as it appears, the delirium as it thickens. It is both brave and horrifying, a man turning himself into his final dataset. A week later, Howard Taylor Ricketts is dead. He is 39 years old. The organism he hunted has claimed him before he could fully cage it. Across the Atlantic, other hunters take up the trail. Among them is an Austrian zoologist and parasitologist whose name will become welded to the disease in a strange memorial. Stanislaus von Prowazek. He studies typhus outbreaks, traveling into danger, as if danger is simply the cost of understanding. He works with infected lice, dissecting their intestines, straining his eyes to find the same phantom Rickett saw. He collaborates with a Brazilian physician and pathologist, Henrique da Rocha Lima, at the Institute for Maritime and Tropical Diseases in Hamburg. When the Great War erupts, their research becomes militarily urgent. The Eastern Front is a typhus furnace. Governments want answers the way drowning men want air. They are sent to a prisoner of war camp at Cottbus, packed with Russian prisoners, lice and fever. It is a horrific laboratory, the kind of place where disease is not an accident, but a predictable consequence of human storage. They continue the work. Blood from prisoners is injected into guinea pigs. Lice are fed, collected, dissected. The air seems thick with threat. In February 1915, Prowazek falls ill. Like Ricketts, he dies within days. Rocha Lima, devastated, continues alone. He carries the notebooks, the papers, the fragments of proof left by dead men. He manages what they could not complete. He isolates the organism and establishes it conclusively as the agent of epidemic typhus. In 1916, with war still chewing Europe apart, he publishes and proposes a name that is both scientific label and gravestone. He calls it Rickettsia prowazekii. The killer now has an identity forged from the fatal courage of the men who pursued it. The courier is known, the assassin is named, and the world is about to respond not with prayer, but with engineering. Baths, steam, heat, industrial war turned inward against the louse. Now the enemy has a name, Rickettsia prowazekii, and its accomplice, the body louse, is no longer just a symbol of poverty, no longer just an irritation to be scratched and cursed. It is identified as a courier of death, a six-legged logistic system moving bacterium from blood to blood. The hunt under microscopes is over. The war of extermination begins. But here's the thing, for a long time, this won't be a war fought with cures. Not with vaccines, not with elegant pills. Not yet. It will be fought with heat, with steel drums and steam pipes, with shaving razors and harsh soap, with the humiliating efficiency of industrial hygiene. World War I becomes the first massive proving ground for this new kind of warfare. Armies that had accepted typhus as an inevitable tax, an ancient companion that stole more men than bullets, finally attempt to fight back at scale. The principle is brutally simple. Lice and their eggs cannot survive high temperatures, so you build systems that bake them out of existence. Behind the front lines, delousing stations appear, long wooden huts, steam-driven machines, hot air sterilizers, autoclaves, ugly contraptions that look like factories because that's what they are. Factories designed to process human bodies the way war processes everything else. The ritual is always the same. A unit arrives, men are marched inside, they strip naked, every last scrap of clothing surrendered, shirts stiff with sweat, underwear that has not been properly washed in months, greatcoats that carry the smell of mud and smoke and old fear. Clothing is bundled and tagged like evidence, heads are often shaved, not for style, for access. Men scrub themselves under cold water with harsh soap that bites the skin. They scrub because it's an order, because it relieves the itch, because the idea of being clean, even briefly, feels like a mercy. Meanwhile, their uniforms are fed into the machines, steam autoclaves, hot air chambers, 30 minutes at a temperature that kills every louse, every nit. Then the men retrieve their clothing, stiff, hot, smelling faintly cooked, and pull it back on like reborn skin. For a few days, maybe a week, the crawling stops. The mind quiets, and then, if conditions remain what they are, the lice return. Because a delousing station is not a cure for poverty or crowding. It is a temporary amputation of an ecosystem that will regrow as soon as it is placed back in its habitat. Still, even temporary relief matters when the alternative is mass fever. The Germans, terrified of typhus sweeping west from the Eastern Front, become masters of what might be called the hygiene train. Entire rail convoys dedicated to washing and delousing. One car for undressing, one for showers, one for drying, several for the ovens. A battalion can be processed in hours. Sanitary cordons are established. Troops moving from the east to the west are cleaned like contaminated cargo. For the first time, hygiene becomes strategy. A military command treats delousing not as personal discipline, but as biological defense. The louse is promoted from nuisance to official enemy. But heat is cumbersome. It requires fuel, equipment, time, resources that war always strains. Science wants something easier, a chemical weapon, a magic bullet that could be deployed cheaply, quickly, massively, without steam engines and rail cars. For 2 decades, laboratories search for it, and then, as the world edges toward another war, it arrives. In 1939, a Swiss chemist named Paul Hermann Müller, working for J.R. Geigy, is screening compounds for moth-proofing wool. Industrial work, practical and unromantic. He tests a white crystalline powder, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, DDT. Its insecticidal properties are astonishing. It is cheap to produce. It is stable, clinging to surfaces for months. And in the understanding of the time, it appears nearly harmless to humans while being lethal to insects, including the body louse. In the context of the early 1940s, it feels like a miracle. When World War II breaks out, the Allies grasp the strategic implication quickly. Typhus has derailed campaigns before. It has hollowed armies from within. It has weaponized misery. If a louse-borne plague erupts behind your lines, you don't just lose civilians, you lose momentum, logistics, the ability to fight. So DDT becomes part of the arsenal. American soldiers receive small shaker cans of powder meant to be dusted inside clothing. It is intimate warfare, a man trying to poison the insects that drink from him. But the first true demonstration, the proof that this powder can stop an epidemic, will not happen in a laboratory or a trench. It will happen in a ruined city. Naples, winter 1943. In Naples is not a romantic ruin, not the kind painters love, not the kind tourists later frame in their minds. It is functional misery. For months it has been bombed. The port and rail yards are pulverized. Buildings stand as hollow shells. Rubble chokes streets. Then, as German forces retreat north in October, they finish the job with the cold intelligence of sabotage. They dynamite infrastructure, sink ships to block the harbor, cut power, destroy aqueducts and sewer lines. They leave behind a city of roughly 1 million people without clean water, without electricity, without sanitation, and with little food. As autumn rains come, people crowd together in unheated buildings, basements, and the ancient tunnel systems beneath the city. The caves are packed with families like cargo in a hold. They are cold, hungry, and close enough to hear each other breathe. And in this congregation, this human compression, the louse thrives. Typhus begins as a smolder, a fever here, a headache there. In the chaos of liberation, it hides in plain sight. Another misery among hundreds. But by December, the numbers rise in the shape that terrifies epidemiologists. Not a gentle curve, but an exponential climb. Hospitals, already strained, fill with delirious patients, their skin blooming with the rash that signals the bacterium has found the bloodstream. For the Allied command, this is not merely a humanitarian issue, It is a strategic threat. Naples is the logistical heart of the Allied Italian campaign. Through its port passes, fuel, ammunition, food, reinforcements, everything that keeps the push north alive. A typhus epidemic here is not just a public health disaster, it is a potential brake on the entire war effort. Because typhus doesn't respect uniforms, a shared blanket, a crowded shelter, a nurse leaning close. That's enough. The louse, apolitical and indifferent, could accomplish what German defenses cannot, paralyze an army by infecting its supply hub. But this time, the Allies are not blind. They remember World War I. They come prepared with a specialized group whose very existence is an admission of how serious this threat is. The US Typhus Commission, created to prevent typhus from derailing operations. They understand something crucial: traditional methods, boiling clothes, shaving heads, quarantining, are too slow. You cannot build enough steam stations to process an entire city in time. You cannot boil the clothing of 1 million civilians in a war zone. What you need is speed. What you need is a weapon that can be delivered in seconds. You need to make human clothing toxic to lice. You need DDT. So the Allied military government, in coordination with public health experts and the Rockefeller Foundation, essentially declares war on the louse. They turn military logistics, normally reserved for moving tanks and ammunition, toward the systematic dusting of human beings. Delousing stations appear across Naples, in cinemas, schools, public buildings, hospital lobbies, and near the caves where refugees shelter. Loudspeaker trucks roam the streets instructing citizens to report. The program targets neighborhoods where cases spike, but also expands broadly because epidemics do not respect district lines. The process is brutally efficient. People line up, men, women, children, thin, weary, exhausted. At the front, a health worker holds a powder duster, sometimes hand-pumped, sometimes powered by compressed air. A nozzle is inserted under the collar. A few sharp squeezes send a cloud of white powder across the chest and back. The nozzle goes up sleeves, down trousers, into waistbands. Powder is puffed into hats, into hair, under skirts. It is fast, impersonal, and stunningly effective. Because DDT doesn't just kill the lice crawling there now, it lingers, turning cloth into a hostile environment for weeks. Newly hatched lice die before they can mature and spread. The scale becomes almost unbelievable. Day after day through January 1944, tens of thousands are dusted. The operation surges until the numbers sound like wartime production quotas. More than 1 million people treated, over 1.3 million by the end of the campaign. A sanitary cordon is established around the city. Anyone moving in or out is dusted, soldiers, civilians, workers, so the epidemic can't escape and seed outbreaks elsewhere. And then something happens that for centuries would have been unthinkable. The epidemic stops. The graphs, the steep rising lines of cases, plateau. Then they plunge. Transmission collapses. By February, the outbreak is dwindling to a trickle. By March, the great Naples typhus epidemic is over. A major urban typhus epidemic has been halted in its tracks. Not by prayer, not by retreat, not by simply waiting for it to burn itself out, by an organized assault on an insect. To the world at the time, DDT feels like salvation in powder form, a clean modern answer to an ancient curse. And for a moment, it really does look like a closing chapter. But history doesn't close its book so neatly. Because even as Naples is being dusted, life saved by chemical warfare against lice. Elsewhere in Europe, typhus is being used differently, not as an enemy to be defeated. As an instrument, a policy, a cultivated weapon of degradation and death. The story turns north now into the ghettos and camps, where the language of hygiene becomes propaganda, and the louse becomes an ideological symbol turned into reality. At the very moment Allied health workers are dusting Naples with DDT, turning civilians into poison for lice, another Europe is moving in the opposite direction. Not toward prevention, toward cultivation. In the north, under Nazi control, typhus is not treated as a public health enemy to be conquered. It is treated as a narrative tool and, in practice, an instrument of oppression. The connection is not incidental. It is ideological. Nazi propaganda is saturated with the language of hygiene, of purity, of cleansing. The state presents itself as a body that must be protected from contamination. And in that sick metaphor, Jews are framed not as human beings, but as parasites. The image repeats across posters and films: the Jew as vermin, the Jew as the carrier of disease. And the symbol they return to, again and again, is the louse. The Jew is the louse. The louse is typhus. Therefore, by the twisted algebra of hate, extermination becomes health. It is grotesque, it is calculated, and it becomes policy. Because once you convince a population that a group is a biological threat, you can lock them up and call it quarantine. You can starve them and call it sanitation. You can murder them and call it civic responsibility. And then you can make the metaphor real. The Warsaw Ghetto becomes the most infamous laboratory for this manufactured catastrophe. In 1940, German authorities seal nearly 500,000 Jews into a small section of the city, only a few square kilometers. The density is crushing. Families are stacked in rooms, buildings overflow, stairwells become living space, and privacy becomes an extinct concept. The official claim to the outside world is that this is quarantine, a protective measure to prevent disease from spreading. It is a lie. The quarantine is designed not to contain disease, but to create the conditions where disease thrives. Food rations are set at starvation levels, numbers that would be laughable if they weren't lethal. Calories low enough to unmake bodies slowly, to dismantle immunity, to turn minor infections into death sentences. Coal is restricted. Winters in Warsaw are brutal, and cold is not just discomfort, it is a biological accelerator. Cold drives crowding, crowd drives lice, lice drive typhus. Sanitation is inadequate by design, water is scarce, soap becomes precious. Waste management fails under impossible population density. The ghetto is engineered as a petri dish. And in that dish, the louse finds paradise. Typhus explodes. At its worst, it infects staggering numbers, tens of thousands sick at once, rash-covered and delirious. The fever becomes background noise. The coughs, the moans, the whispered prayers, the shuffling footsteps of people too weak to walk normally. And here is the piece that does not get said enough. Inside the ghetto, Jewish doctors and nurses fight back with desperate intelligence. They do not have antibiotics. They do not have insecticides in useful supply. They do not have political power or sufficient food. But they have knowledge and will. They organize clandestine medical education. They hold secret public health lectures. They teach hygiene with the seriousness of survival. They attempt isolation. They attempt delousing with whatever crude means they can assemble. They understand the louse. They understand typhus. They also understand the Germans are blocking soap and disinfectant on purpose. Emanuel Ringelblum, the historian of the ghetto, writes in his secret archive about these typhus politics, the way authorities use disease as justification while simultaneously nurturing it. Typhus becomes the perfect pretext. The Germans can point to the epidemic as proof that Jews are unclean, proof the ghetto must remain sealed, proof that cruelty is necessity. And when deportations to death camps begin, the epidemic provides another excuse. They are simply relocating people from a disease-ridden zone. A manufactured disaster becomes an alibi. A microbe becomes bureaucracy's mask. From the ghettos, the system extends into the camp network, concentration camps, labor camps, extermination camps, places designed for dehumanization so total it reaches into biology. At the gates, the stripping begins. Hair shaved, clothing removed, identity erased. Prisoners are issued thin uniforms that may already be infested from previous occupants. They are crammed into unheated barracks, sleeping in tiers of bunks so tight that turning over requires negotiation. Latrines overflow. Soap is rare to non-existent. Starvation is policy. It is an environment that dismantles every defense, physical and immune. Then the louse does what it always does. It thrives in crowding and unwashed cloth. Typhus becomes one of the camp system's most reliable killers. It requires no bullets, no gas, no transport logistics. It requires only neglect deliberately administered. The guards fear the disease even as they cultivate the conditions for it. They enforce strict delousing for themselves while ensuring prisoners remain infested. The ideology is enacted in daily practice. The masters must remain clean. The prisoners must remain a reservoir of filth and fever. For countless victims, death arrives not only in gas chambers or firing pits, but on a wooden bunk, delirious, fevered, rash blooming across skin, body failing from hunger and infection at once. Two of the most famous victims of this system die not by bullet or gas, but by the fever itself. Bergen-Belsen, early 1945. The camp collapses under a flood of prisoners transferred from elsewhere as Allied forces close in. Infrastructure disintegrates completely. Typhus rages unchecked. In this chaos, Anne Frank, 15 years old, already weakened by malnutrition, succumbs to the fever. Her sister Margot dies shortly before her. Their deaths are not an accident. They are a predictable outcome of a machine built to convert human beings into biological waste. A system that turned a microbe into policy and a louse into a soldier. And still, even with that darkness on the record, the post-war world comes away with a strange belief that science has finally won. Because in places like Naples, it seems to have. After 1945, typhus recedes from the public imagination in much of the West. It doesn't vanish everywhere, but it fades from the center of attention, pushed back by a tripod of progress. First, insecticides. DDT goes global, part of the bright optimistic belief that chemistry can erase pests and therefore erase pest-borne disease. Public health campaigns treat houses, dust clothing, spray walls. Second, antibiotics. The war accelerates mass production of penicillin, and soon other drugs, tetracyclines, doxycycline, prove highly effective against rickettsial infections. For the first time, epidemic typhus is not only preventable, but treatable. A disease that once carried terrifying mortality becomes, in many contexts, a curable fever when diagnosed and treated in time. Third, improved living conditions. This is the quiet revolution that matters more than hero chemicals. Indoor plumbing spreads. Hot water becomes normal. People own more than one set of clothing. Washing machines appear. Regular bathing becomes routine. Crowding decreases in many places. The ecological niche the body louse requires, unwashed clothing worn continuously, dense long-term crowding, shrinks. In developed nations, the louse loses habitat. Without the louse, Rickettsia prowazekii loses its root. So typhus becomes, for many, a historical story. Napoleon, prisons, refugee ships, camps. Something old, something solved. Public health infrastructure built to fight it is repurposed or dismantled. Institutional memory fades. Younger doctors rarely see it. The diagnosis slips down the list. People worry about heart disease, cancer, HIV, not typhus. It feels like victory, but the disease never truly disappears. It retreats into the places modern life does not fully reach, into the shadows where hygiene is not a habit, but a resource. It becomes an indicator species of societal breakdown. When housing collapses, when water systems fail, when war displaces people into camps, when prisons become overcrowded warehouses, the louse returns. And where the louse returns, the bacterium waits. In the 1990s, in Central Africa, during civil war and genocide, hundreds of thousands are forced into massive refugee camps. Overcrowding, scarce water, limited soap, winter cold in highlands, trauma, hunger. The old pattern reappears with chilling familiarity. Typhus flares. Aid agencies scramble to respond, setting up emergency delousing, distributing soap, rushing doxycycline. The long lines of exhausted people look disturbingly like archival photographs, as if history has pulled on the same costume again. It appears too in other corners, overcrowded prisons, among homeless populations in cold weather cities where people huddle together in shelters, sharing blankets and clothing. Anywhere the thin veil of routine hygiene tears, the louse finds a foothold. And there is another sinister trick in the pathogen's repertoire. A person who survived epidemic typhus can carry the organism silently for years, decades. Later in life, under stress or age-weakened immunity, it can reactivate as a milder illness, known as Brill-Zinsser disease. That person becomes a reservoir again. Lice feeding on them can pick up the bacterium and seed new outbreaks when conditions are right. The pathogen has a long memory, so does evolution. The silver bullet begins to dull. Lice develop resistance to DDT and other insecticides. Antibiotic overuse raises the broader fear of resistance, a reminder that chemical shields are never permanent. Even if drug-resistant typhus is not yet the main clinical story, the possibility sits in the room like a quiet threat. Typhus is no longer the unavoidable camp follower of every army, but it remains a low-level hazard wherever people are crowded, cold, and unwashed. And then the story takes one last turn, away from disease as opportunist toward disease as intention. Because in the modern era, typhus is not only a plague that exploits chaos, it is also potentially a blueprint for creating it. There's a difference between an old enemy and a new fear. Typhus has always been an enemy of circumstance, crowding, hunger, unwashed cloth, winter, war. It flourishes when systems fail, when people are pressed together and stripped of options. But the modern world adds something colder, the possibility that someone might choose it. That a pathogen which once rode passively in the seams of misery could be cultivated, packaged, and aimed, not as an accident of collapse, but as a method for creating collapse. When you look at Rickettsia prowazekii through a strategic lens, you begin to understand why security analysts don't treat it as a relic. It's not the most famous agent, it's not as iconic as anthrax or smallpox, but it has a particular utility. Agencies like the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention classify potential bioterror agents into categories. Category A is the highest, agents that can cause mass casualties and societal disruption with terrifying efficiency. Typhus sits in Category B, still dangerous, still disruptive, still worth serious concern. Category B agents are often described as moderately easy to disseminate and capable of causing significant illness while demanding enhanced diagnostic capacity. That last phrase matters, because bioterrorism is not always about maximizing the body count. Often it's about overwhelming systems, panic, paralysis. Typhus is very good at that. Consider it from the perspective of someone who wants to break a city without dropping a bomb. First, untreated epidemic typhus can carry a substantial mortality rate, often cited in broad ranges depending on conditions and care, sometimes climbing into horrifying territory when treatment is absent and populations are weakened. Second, even when it doesn't kill, it incapacitates. High fever, brutal headache, muscle pain, neurological symptoms, delirium. People don't power through typhus. They collapse. A city's workforce vanishes into beds. Hospitals fill. First responders become patients. And then there's the timing. Typhus has an incubation period, often around 1 to 2 weeks. That delay is a gift to anyone trying to create confusion. For days after exposure, nothing obvious happens. People move, work, travel, share spaces. When symptoms begin, they are maddeningly non-specific. Fever, chills, severe headache, indistinguishable at first from influenza or countless other infections. Only later, several days into illness, does the characteristic rash often appear. By then, the outbreak has a head start. The question becomes not how do we stop the first cases, but how do we control something already dispersed? Now, how could it be disseminated? Historically, typhus is louse-borne. The vector is the classic route. In theory, a malicious actor could attempt to breed infected lice and release them in a vulnerable location. Crowded shelters, detention centers, refugee encampments, transit hubs. The attack would be invisible. No smell, no explosion, no immediate casualties. Just insects finding warmth and doing what insects do. There are also darker theoretical paths discussed in biodefense circles. Laboratory growth and aerosolization of pathogens. Rickettsia are not as hardy as anthrax spores, but the idea of aerosol dissemination has been raised as a scenario because it bypasses the vector entirely. That doesn't mean it's simple, safe, or easy. These organisms are hazardous to handle and require specialized conditions. But the point is not that it's easy for everyone. The point is that it's possible enough to merit vigilance. And vigilance is complicated by another truth. Modern microbiology has a dual nature. The same techniques that allow diagnostics and vaccine research can be used to cultivate pathogens. The same equipment can detect disease or produce it. That's not paranoia, it's the fundamental moral weight of knowledge. None of this is a new human impulse. Biological warfare is as old as warfare itself. Ancient armies understood that poisoned wells and rotting carcasses could do work that weapons could not. In the 14th century, attackers at the siege of Kaffa reportedly hurled plague-ridden corpses over city walls, weaponizing contagion in a crude but effective way. In the 20th century, the impulse was industrialized into a science. One of the most infamous examples is Unit 731 of the Imperial Japanese Army, operating in occupied Manchuria and parts of China. Under General Shiro Ishii, this unit conducted horrific experiments on prisoners and developed biological weapons with a chilling pragmatism. They bred vectors, fleas and lice, infected them, and designed dispersal systems such as bombs intended to release clouds of insects over populated areas. Plague and cholera are the better-known parts of that story. But rickettsial agents were studied too, because anyone who has read the history of typhus knows what it can do when civil systems are strained. During the Cold War, large state programs in the US and the Soviet Union explored biological agents in depth. While headline fears often centered on anthrax and smallpox, rickettsial diseases were part of the broader landscape of research and contingency planning. Today, those massive programs are largely dismantled. But knowledge does not dismantle itself, and as threats decentralize, non-state actors, lone actors, unstable regimes, the anxiety shifts from which superpower has a stockpile to who can access techniques and expertise. So typhus lingers not only as a disease of poverty and displacement, but as a theoretical weapon of mass disruption, a blueprint that sits quietly in literature, security briefings, and the uneasy imagination of people paid to anticipate nightmares. And yet, this is the part that matters most. Typhus is not unstoppable. The lesson of the 20th century is that it can be beaten when you understand its ecology. Even in the worst conditions, the chain can be broken. Delousing works, clean clothing works, soap works. Antibiotics work, when diagnosis is made in time and medicine is available. That's why typhus is often less a monster than a barometer. When it appears, it tells you something about the world, that crowding has intensified, that hygiene has collapsed, that people are living in conditions where parasites can become infrastructure. It is an index of neglect. So the defense against typhus is not only laboratories and intelligence agencies, it is housing, it is public health, it is sanitation and water systems. It is the ability of a society to keep people from being forced into the kind of closeness where lice become inevitable. The fight is medical, yes, but it is also political. Now I can feel you asking, after all this, after Nicole, after DDT, after antibiotics, what does typhus look like now? Not the legend, the modern reality. Because there's a twist most people miss. Epidemic typhus is rarer in wealthy countries, but the louse never truly left. and neither did the broader family of typhus-like disease. There are other rickettsial fevers, murine typhus, for example, associated with fleas, rodents, urban ecology. There are outbreaks among vulnerable populations, including people experiencing homelessness, where crowding and limited access to laundering creates conditions the body louse can exploit. There are prisons and detention facilities where overcrowding and poor hygiene are not accidents, but consequences of policy. There are refugee crises where the same ancient pattern reappears: flight, crowding, cold, unwashed clothing, fever. In those environments, typhus is not a historical curiosity, it is a practical threat. And because it's rare in some places, it is also easy to miss. Doctors may not recognize it quickly. Early symptoms mimic flu, and by the time rash appears, the patient has been ill for days. Which brings us back to the core truth I keep circling like a moth around a lamp. Typhus is a disease of seams. It lives in the thin interfaces between bodies and clothing, between crowded people and failing infrastructure, between war and the breakdown that war creates. And whenever those seams fray, the old commander returns. So where do we go from here? We go back to the broader arc, because the louse doesn't just haunt one century at a time, it threads through them, shaping wars, prisons, migrations, and policies. We've watched it slaughter in Granada's camp, climb into the courtrooms of England, dictate the tempo of the 30 Years' War, hollow Napoleon's Grande Armée, ride famine ships to Canada, stalk Scutari's wards, infest civil war tents, and devastate Serbia. We've watched scientists die, to name it. We've watched cities be saved by white powder. We've watched ideology weaponize it. Now, in the final stretch of our journey, I want to do two things. First, pull the story into a concluding synthesis. What these episodes mean when you lay them side by side, what kind of character typhus really is in the history of humanity. Second, end where I began, at the level of the intimate, the itch, the seam, the small act that decides whether the invisible war spreads. Because this isn't just history, it's instruction, not in fear, but in recognition. The smallest enemies are patient, and they are always waiting for us to forget. If you lay these centuries side by side, a pattern emerges so clean it feels like an equation. Not a moral equation, not sin leads to sickness, the old sermon so many rulers loved because it kept them innocent. A mechanical equation, crowding, plus unwashed clothing, plus weakened bodies, plus time, harsh lice. Lice plus rickettsia prowazeki, harsh epidemic typhus. Epidemic typhus plus movement. History rewritten. That's the part people resist, the idea that the grand narratives of kings and ideologies can be bent by something smaller than a fingernail. We are trained to imagine history as the product of human intention, but intention is only one force. Biology is another, and biology doesn't negotiate. Typhus is not clever in the way a general is clever. It is relentless in the way a fire is relentless. It does not strategize, it exploits. It does not plan, it waits. It is, in a bleak sense, honest. You give it the conditions it requires, and it will take what it can. Granada taught us the first clear version of the lesson. The most disciplined army in Europe could be undone by the ecology of its own camp. The Black Assizes taught us the second. You cannot build suffering behind walls and expect it to stay there. The 30 Years' War taught the third. Mobility plus hunger equals epidemic on an almost biblical scale. Napoleon proved the lesson could destroy even a modern logistical mind when he overlooked the smallest variable. Ireland proved famine doesn't need to kill directly if it can weaken bodies enough to let microbes finish the job. Crimea proved that sanitation can be a battlefield and that a single stubborn reformer with a brush can change mortality curves. The American Civil War proved that supply chains and soap can matter as much as rifles. Serbia proved that modern armies can still be annihilated by fever faster than by artillery. Then science stepped in and changed the rules. Nicole's observation, so simple it almost hurts, gave humanity a target. Ricketts and Proazek and Rocha Lima paid in blood to name the assassin. The First World War's delousing stations turned hygiene into strategy. DDT made the strategy fast enough to outrun an urban epidemic. For a moment, it looked like the story would end. But typhus doesn't end the way stories want to end. It doesn't vanish in a final scene. It recedes and it waits. It returns when we forget that the conditions are the true enemy. So let me bring you closer. Back down from empires to the seam of a collar. Because typhus is not a disease you catch in abstraction, you catch it in specific human ways. A borrowed coat, a shared blanket, a crowded shelter on a freezing night, a prison dormitory where laundry is a privilege, a refugee camp where one bar of soap must serve an entire family for a week, a hospital ward where clean linens are scarce. One of the most dangerous things about typhus, especially in places where it's rare, is how easily it hides at the beginning. The early symptoms are generic. Fever, chills, headache, muscle pain. Doctors think influenza. They think COVID in the modern era. They think viral illness. They tell people to rest, drink fluids, ride it out. But typhus is not impressed by reassurance. When the rash appears days later, the patient is already deep in the illness. If antibiotics are available and the diagnosis is made, outcomes improve dramatically. If not, if the patient is malnourished, elderly, immunocompromised, or trapped in ongoing exposure, the old mortality can climb again. And this is why the disease still matters, because it shows up where systems are strained and attention is thin. What does a typhus response look like when it's done right? It looks boring. That's the truth no one wants, because boring doesn't sell heroism. It looks like laundry facilities and access to showers. It looks like clean clothing distribution. It looks like controlling crowding, improving ventilation, creating space. It looks like targeted delousing when body lice are detected, topical insecticides, environmental cleaning, treating clothing and bedding. In emergencies, it can look like mass delousing campaigns that echo Naples, minus the DDT mythos, and with modern awareness of environmental impacts and insecticide resistance. It looks like clinicians trained to recognize the possibility, especially when caring for vulnerable populations, people experiencing homelessness, those in shelters, those in detention settings, displaced persons. It looks like surveillance and rapid diagnosis, because in outbreaks, time is everything. And in the background, it looks like something even less glamorous. Stability. Typhus is, at heart, a disease that feeds on instability. Housing shortages, war, forced migration, infrastructure failure. You want to defeat typhus? Then you don't just kill lice, you maintain the world that makes lice hard to sustain. This is why typhus persists as an indicator species, like a canary in the coal mine, but uglier and more lethal. It tells you something about your social fabric is failing. And now, because we're nearing the end of our journey, I want to return to Naples one last time, not to repeat the story, but to underline what it represented. Naples was not simply a triumph of chemistry, it was a triumph of organization. A city was collapsing, infrastructure was broken, people were crowded into caves, typhus had ignited, and instead of accepting it as inevitable, a coordinated machine moved in with a clear understanding of the vector. They attacked the louse's habitat. They broke the chain. They did in weeks what used to take seasons of death. That is the lesson to carry forward. When you know the mechanism, you can design intervention. But interventions don't exist in a vacuum. They sit inside politics, ethics, and history. DDT later becomes infamous for environmental harm. Insecticide resistance grows. Antibiotic stewardship becomes a global concern. The easy, absolute confidence of the 1940s collapses into the more complicated truth of modern public health. Every tool has a cost. Every victory is conditional. Every solution must be maintained. Typhus doesn't need you to be ignorant forever. It only needs you to be complacent long enough. I told you earlier I'm the Forbidden Dispensary. And the forbidden part is this: I don't just talk about pathogens. I talk about what they reveal. Typhus reveals the lie that modernity is permanent. It reveals that empires can be brittle. It reveals that the boundary between civilized and collapsed is sometimes thinner than we're comfortable admitting. A war breaks a sewer line. A recession empties shelters. A government overcrowds prisons. A flood displaces thousands. And suddenly the old ecology returns. Cloth worn too long, bodies too close, hunger, cold, and the tiny courier crawling in the seam. That is why typhus has always been more than a disease. It is a mirror held up to how we manage human beings. Now, there are two final chapters we still have to walk through. First, the modern afterlife of the louse and its cousins, how rickettsial disease persists in different forms, and how outbreaks look today when they occur in vulnerable communities far from the battlefields that made typhus famous. Second, the closing synthesis, what it means to live in a world where the ancient plague is quieter, rarer, but never fully gone, and where the same knowledge that saves lives can be twisted into a weapon, not to leave you in fear, but to leave you in clarity, because clarity is the first defense. And the louse hates nothing more than a world that is paying attention. Typhus has a reputation that's both accurate and misleading. Accurate because epidemic typhus, the classic louse-borne catastrophe, has shaped wars, famines, prisons, and mass migrations. Misleading because the word typhus in casual speech often becomes a bucket people throw fevers into, while the real rickettsial world is more varied and more geographically adaptable than most realize. Epidemic typhus, the one we've followed like a shadow through centuries, is louse-borne and tends to flare when human beings are compressed by disaster. But rickettsial disease doesn't only live in uniforms and prison straw. There is murine typhus, typically linked to fleas and rodents, an urban ecology problem rather than an army problem. There are spotted fever group rickettsiosis linked to ticks in many parts of the world. Different vectors, different reservoirs, similar lesson. Small arthropods become infrastructure for microbial travel. And in modern cities, even in wealthy nations, you can still find the conditions where the body louse survives. Places where people cannot reliably bathe or launder, where clothing is worn continuously, where crowding is chronic. Homeless shelters during cold snaps, encampments, overcrowded detention facilities, underfunded prisons. Anywhere warmth, density, and limited access to clean clothing come together. It's not the medieval camp anymore, but biologically the difference is smaller than we like to admit. That's why forgotten diseases return, not because they're nostalgic, but because their ecology returns. When clinicians do encounter modern louse-borne outbreaks, a few themes appear again and again. The first is delayed recognition. Typhus can look like flu early on. If a doctor has never seen it, it may not appear in the first round of differential diagnoses. That delay matters because treatment is most effective when started early. The second is clustering in vulnerable communities, not because those communities are inherently unclean, but because the resources that make lice hard to sustain, regular laundering, multiple changes of clothing, private space, are unevenly distributed. The third is the need for coordinated response. Typhus is not just treat the patient, it's treat the patient and break the chain. Delouse, clean bedding and clothing, address crowding, provide access to showers and laundry, use appropriate insecticidal measures when indicated. And if you want a single truth to remember, it's this: antibiotics treat the person. Public health treats the outbreak. A prescription can save one life. Clean clothing and delousing can prevent 100 infections. That's the difference between medicine as rescue and medicine as prevention. Now, the most unsettling modern feature of epidemic typhus is not its rarity. It's its persistence mechanism. You can survive epidemic typhus and still carry its potential. Years later, the bacterium can reactivate as Brill-Zinsser disease, often milder but still capable of returning Rickettsia prowazekii to the world. If lice feed on that person, the chain can restart. Think about what that means in human terms. The pathogen can wait out decades, tucked into the body of someone who believes they left it behind long ago. It doesn't need to burn continuously across populations. It can hibernate in individuals, waiting for conditions, crowding, neglect, cold, to become favorable again. This is why eradication is so difficult. It isn't only about eliminating a vector, it's also about reservoirs, reactivation, and the fact that rare does not mean gone. And on top of that, the tools that once felt absolute are no longer absolute. Lice develop resistance, insecticides lose power. Public trust in mass chemical interventions is complicated by environmental history and by the fact that people have been lied to before in the name of safety. Antibiotic stewardship is a constant balancing act. Use enough to treat, avoid overuse that breeds resistance elsewhere. So modern typhus control is less like a clean final victory and more like maintenance. Like keeping a levee intact rather than slaying a dragon. And then there's the other modern layer, security. The idea that typhus could be used deliberately is not just science fiction, but it is also not a casual threat. It requires expertise, access, willingness to handle dangerous organisms, and the ability to disseminate effectively. It's not something a random person accomplishes in a basement. But hard is not the same as impossible, which is why public health and biodefense overlap in uncomfortable ways. The same actions that make typhus outbreaks unlikely. Stable housing, sanitation, routine laundering access, rapid diagnosis, stockpiled antibiotics, outbreak response plans, also make the weaponization scenario far less effective. That's the paradox. The best biodefense is often ordinary public health. And the worst vulnerability is not a lack of bombs. It's neglected systems and neglected people. Typhus exploits those gaps, whether the gap is created by war, poverty, or malice. So what should the end of this story sound like? Not triumphal, because triumph invites sleep. Not apocalyptic, because apocalypse can become entertainment, and entertainment doesn't motivate maintenance. The end should sound like a warning delivered in a calm voice, the kind of warning that respects you enough to be honest. Typhus is quieter now in many places. It is, in much of the developed world, no longer the everyday terror it once was. That is real progress. That's plumbing. That's laundry machines. That's antibiotics. That's surveillance and sanitation and boring budgets allocated to invisible prevention. But those gains are conditional. They can be reversed locally when conditions collapse. A disaster zone can become an incubator. A refugee camp can become a city without sewers. A prison can become a medieval dormitory with fluorescent lights. And the louse is patient. It does not have ideology, it has biology. Let me take you back, finally, to the seam of a collar. If you want to understand the tyrannical power of small things, imagine the act that begins so many outbreaks. A man scratches. That's all. He scratches an itch under his shirt, rubs skin raw, and in that thoughtless motion, he completes the chain between insect waste and bloodstream. History loves to talk about decisions. Napoleon deciding to march deeper, Ferdinand deciding to hold the siege, diplomats deciding to keep fighting. But microbes don't need your decisions. They need your habits. They need your crowding. They need your neglect. Typhus, in that sense, is one of the purest diseases in history. It is not a moral punishment and not a random lightning strike. It is a predictable consequence of specific conditions that can be changed, if you are willing to change them. And that is where the real horror lives, not that typhus exists, but that we know how to prevent so much of it, and still allow conditions where it can thrive. We're almost done. One last part remains, and it's where I tie the thread through everything. Granada's dust, Oxford's courtroom, the German camps, Napoleon's snow, Irish coffin ships, Scutari's wards, Confederate graybacks, Serbian collapse, Tunisian observation, laboratory sacrifice, Naples dusting, and the modern shadow of weaponization. Not as a list, as a single story. A story about how human beings build environments, sometimes by accident, sometimes by policy, and how the smallest life forms move into those environments like inheritors. If you've stayed with me this far, don't look away now, because the final lesson isn't about lice. It's about what we become when we decide some people can live in conditions we would never accept for ourselves. Here is the thread, pulled tight. Granada, 1489. A disciplined army builds a tent city with cannon and confidence, believing war is a matter of steel and will. The camp has no sewers, no real laundering, no space. In the seams of uniforms, lice multiply. In the lice, rickettsia prowazeki waits. Men scratch, fever climbs, a rash blooms like a cruel flag. Thousands die, and the siege nearly collapses, not because the walls are unbreakable, but because the camp is. Oxford, 1577, law gathers in a hot courtroom, and the prison below breathes upward through the clothing of prisoners. The powerful wrinkle their noses at the stench and raise perfumed cloths, as if scent is the danger. Then the fever climbs the social ladder. Judges and jurors die. The Black Assizes become a verdict delivered by biology. The boundary between the dungeon and the bench is not real. Germany, 1618 to 1648, war becomes a moving ecosystem. Armies as crawling cities, supply as theft, hunger as policy. Troops strip regions bare and leave civilians starving. Starvation unthreads immunity. Crowding unthreads hygiene. Lice and fever travel in both directions, soldier to peasant and refugee to town. Campaigns end because the army can't function. Entire provinces empty, forest returns to fields. The war's victor is not simply a dynasty, it is the insect that thrives on collapse. Russia, 1812. Napoleon brings the most ambitious military machine Europe has seen and believes his ledgers can account for the world. The Grande Armée marches in dense warmth, uniform seams alive. Typhus begins quietly, then accelerates, thinning columns before battle can. Moscow burns, retreat begins, cold forces men closer, hunger shatters them, and typhus becomes a furnace. Of 500,000, a fraction returns, and the survivors seed new epidemics as they limp west. The myth of General Winter is convenient. The truth is smaller and it crawls. Ireland, 1840s. The potato fails and famine enters like a silent occupation. People are evicted, forced onto roads, into workhouses, into holds of ships. The blight does not need to kill everyone. It only needs to make bodies weak enough that infection can finish the job. The louse thrives in rags worn too long. Typhus boards coffin ships and spills onto quarantine islands where mass graves fill. Famine fever becomes a second harvest, one reaped by microbes. Crimea, 1854. Industrial war arrives wrapped in aristocratic incompetence. Soldiers freeze and sicken in trenches, then are shipped to Scutari, where overcrowding and filth make the hospital a factory for death. Florence Nightingale does not know germ theory, but she knows environment. She cleans, she ventilates, she launders, she fights for soap and drainage the way other people fight for artillery. And death rates fall, not because she defeats an enemy in combat, but because she attacks the enemy's habitat. America, 1863. Graybacks in Confederate seams become an emblem of collapsing logistics. Soap is scarce. Clothing can't be replaced. Camps become crowded ecosystems. Men skirmish with lice using heated blades, but the war is unwinnable by ritual. Typhus and other diseases erase regiments without a shot fired. The war is decided not only by generals, but by supply chains, sanitation, and the invisible arithmetic of immune systems. Serbia, 1915. A nation wins a miracle against an invader and is then hollowed by the prisoners and refugees that victory produces. Typhus spreads explosively. Rail crews die, government sputters, doctors perish. The army ceases to exist as an effective force. International teams respond with delousing baths, sanitation squads, total war on a parasite. It works painfully, but only after the disease has already rewritten the strategic map. Tunis, 1909. Charles Nicolle watches typhus stop at hospital doors and asks why. He sees the bath, the clothing change. He sees the louse without yet seeing the bacterium. He proves the chain in chimpanzees and turns a mysterious curse into a targetable enemy. He doesn't cure typhus, he makes it intelligible. He opens the door to prevention. Mexico City and beyond, 1910-1916. Ricketts hunts the organism and dies of it, documenting his own decline. Proazek continues and dies of it. Rocha Lima finishes what they began and names the agent, Rickettsia proazekii, as a memorial engraved in Latin. Science progresses the way war does, through sacrifice, through people who walk too close to the hazard so others can stand farther away. World War I. Armies build delousing stations and hygiene trains. Men strip and scrub and bake their uniforms, not for comfort, but for survival. Hygiene becomes strategy. It is clumsy and incomplete, but it is a declaration. The louse is now officially an enemy combatant. Naples, 1943-44, a ruined city becomes an incubator and an experiment. DDT is deployed not as myth, but as logistics, dusting over 1 million civilians, breaking transmission, halting an epidemic in weeks. It is one of history's cleanest public health victories, and for a moment it suggests the ancient scourge can be ended. And even as Naples is being saved, the North shows the mirror image. Ghettos and camps engineered for crowding, hunger, cold, and filth. Disease is used as propaganda and allowed to flourish as part of a system of extermination. The louse becomes symbol and instrument. Typhus becomes both pretext and consequence. The horror is not only that people die of fever, it is that a state can design the habitat of fever and call it order. Post-war, plumbing, laundry, antibiotics, improved housing, all the boring infrastructure that kills the louse's ecosystem, push epidemic typhus into the margins in many countries. The disease becomes history in textbooks, a story about old wars, then modern crises, refugee camps, civil conflict, overcrowded prisons, homelessness, tear holes in the fabric again. The louse returns where the world frays. The pathogen waits in human bodies for decades and can reactivate. Resistance dulls insecticides, complacency dulls memory. And now the modern shadow, the possibility that someone could weaponize what used to be only opportunistic. Typhus as a tool of disruption, not simply a symptom of collapse. The idea is chilling, not because it's easy, but because the same societal cracks that allow typhus to thrive naturally are the cracks that would make deliberate harm easier to amplify. So what is this story, really? It's not just a chronicle of fevers and wars, it's a story about congregation, about what happens when human beings are forced, by policy, poverty, war, or disaster, into conditions where private space disappears. Clothing can't be washed, food is scarce, and cold demands closeness. Typhus is a disease of those conditions. It is, in that sense, a moral document, but not because it punishes sin, because it exposes priorities. Whenever a society decides that some people can live packed into filth, prisoners, refugees, the poor, the defeated, the displaced, typhus waits in the seams like a quiet auditor. It keeps its own books, it balances its own ledgers. It doesn't care who you are, only whether you are close enough and worn thin enough to be used. This is what the Forbidden Dispensary wants you to carry with you. The greatest enemies are not always brilliant. Sometimes they are simply well adapted. A louse does not need ideology, it needs a collar, a sleeve, a waistband, and a crowd. Rickettsia does not need hatred, it needs a root. The root is us, when we allow the habitat to exist. And we have always been tempted to treat hygiene as personal virtue rather than public infrastructure, something the poor should do rather than something they must be enabled to do. Typhus laughs at that distinction. It walks through it. It crawls across it. It proves again and again that health is not only individual choice, it is collective architecture. So if you want the final lesson, here it is. And it's as unromantic as everything else in this tale. When you build a world where people can bathe, launder, eat, and sleep with space between bodies, you don't just create comfort, you create biological defense. When you build a world where people cannot, when you warehouse them, starve them, crowd them, freeze them, you don't just create suffering, you create vectors, you build an army for the louse, and sooner or later, that army marches. I'm the Forbidden Dispensary, and if you've made it to the end, you've just walked through 5 centuries of proof that the smallest commanders are often the most decisive, and that the future of epidemics is decided less by microscopes than by whether we maintain the fragile, boring systems that keep our seams clean. If you want, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'll be reading, and until next time, watch the seams.